On this episode of the Stinking Albatross Podcast.
To this, the gaslighting is crazy.
They would dump the box, all the ballots come out, and then you see 9 of them stuck together.
If you want to make change on issues like these, you need people with firsthand experience who really understand the urgency and the impacts on the ground.
For 20 years or so, they've been compliant. They've been nice. They've been polishing, picture frames in other people's offices.
Clapping seals and bobbleheads. That's what we like to say.
But if you want to turn a safe riding red, you're going to put someone in there that makes them question, why do I even vote conservative?
So do they just expect us not to know or just to turn a blind eye? Because I was there through the whole Patrick Brown fiasco and he was doing the exact same thing.
But I think at the base of conservative values is an agreement that democracy is important. Freedom is important. We're against censorship. And that's the baseline we can always agree on. Then everything comes along after that.
Today's episode is brought to you by Larosse Media Incorporated. They make professional videos to fit any budget, so next time you need a commercial, promo, or corporate video, think Larosse. Check them out at larossemedia.com. Hello and welcome to the Stinking Albatross Podcast. My name is Alissa Globe, and I'm here once again with my partner in crime, Scott Hayward. How is it going, Scott?
Well, my prediction of the Stanley Cup Final going to 7 games looks like it might come true tonight. We'll have to see in a few hours.
Yeah, we'll see. We have 2 guests with us, Sabrina and Wyatt, and I'm going to do intros in a second, but are you guys into hockey at all? We always start the podcast with hockey, much to the chagrin of a lot of our listeners.
I follow very loosely, so I probably don't have much to add to this conversation.
Do you have a favorite team?
I am aware there's a game tonight, and of course I'm cheering for the Oilers because I'd love to see Canada win. So,
Wyatt?
I'm basically in the same vein, but I'm more of a dork, so I'm like, well, I want the Oilers to win because it'd be good for the Alberta economy, and we get more games going on here. That's as far as I care about. I watch curling, and during the Olympics, I'll watch weightlifting.
That is random, but cool. All right, well, let's do some intros here. We have a special podcast today, as you know, and we have 2 guests. We have Sabrina Maddeaux and Wyatt Claypool, and we're going to talk about the nomination process and specifically what happened to these 2 in their respective nominations. Sabrina is a journalist and political commentator, as well as a freelance columnist for the National Post. She has her BA in political science and a double minor in journalism and theology. In 2022, she secured Pierre Poilievre's first mainstream media interview after becoming leader of the Conservative Party, and she was recently the nomination candidate for the Conservative Party for the riding of Aurora Oak Ridge's Richmond Hill before she suspended her campaign due to nefarious goings-on, which we'll get to later on. Wyatt Claypool has been writing news and opinion articles online for 5 years and currently runs his own news publication, The National Telegraph. He has his bachelor's degree and master's in public policy, and he was recently running in the nomination for Calgary Signal Hill until he learned just weeks before the nomination meeting that he had been disqualified, along with former UCP MLA Leela Heer, for virtually no other reason than he was not the favored candidate for the party. So thank you guys both for coming on. We really appreciate having this important discussion. But Sabrina, let's start with you. Just to be upfront, I mean, you're not a social conservative. We've read your articles, and I think that we fall almost on the opposite ends of a lot of social issues. But that being said, I think where we unite is that we all want the Conservative Party to have open and fair nominations, not just in word, but also in action. But let's start from the beginning, because that's where, I want our listeners to have a full understanding of what happened to both of you from the very beginning. So what kind of drew you to run in the nomination in the first place, and what draws you to the Conservative Party in general?
I was drawn to run for a few reasons. A big one was I've been writing about affordability and the housing crisis for years and have been, I think, one of the lead voices on that file for the National Post. As a renter myself and a millennial who's been impacted by Trudeau's disastrous policies on those files firsthand, I was definitely inspired to take the next step to try to make change from the inside rather than just commentating on it and analyzing it from the outside. And the truth is there aren't still a lot of younger MPs in Parliament. There certainly aren't many renters in Parliament. And I do believe that if you want to make change on issues like these, you need people with firsthand experience who really understand the urgency and the impacts on the ground. At the same time, I was very inspired by Pierre's leadership campaign and what he stands for, certainly creating a freer country, standing up against censorship, and also having, open and fair nominations and elections and our conservative values of democracy. As you mentioned, Conservatives are a big tent party, of course. And, you and I don't always agree on all the social issues, but I think at the base of Conservative values is an agreement that democracy is important, freedom is important, we're against censorship, and that's the baseline we can always agree on, then everything comes along after that. So that's what led me to jump into the race initially.
Is this something you had been planning for a while, or was this something that kind of came to after Pierre won his leadership? Were you sort of asked by the party or encouraged by party members? Like, how did this idea come to mind? Because you are a successful journalist, so why make that switch?
I wouldn't say it was something I'd been planning for a long time. I certainly never, had years of planning to become an MP or wanting to get into elected politics. But I thought the issues had become so pressing. And again, there are a lot of barriers to younger people and renters running. And given the platform that I had and the connections and the knowledge of the system, I thought that it was, upon me to take a shot at this to try and be that different type of voice in Parliament. So I had probably been considering for a few months prior to when I actually announced, going through the stages, all the background work. I had conversations with people within the party. They were certainly encouraging up until I announced. Later on, though, some of that began to change, and there were warning signs along the way for, quite frankly, months before I finally took the step of suspending my campaign.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's be really interesting to get into that because, we were aware and hearing things, of course, because it's our job, right, to get involved in nominations right across the country. And we're involved in a nomination in Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill for a different candidate. But we were aware of different things that were happening in your riding in particular along the way from, people on the ground and people involved in different nomination campaigns. And I'd love to get into that a little bit. But why don't we get you in here and part of this discussion? Kind of same question to you. Firstly, like, what draws you specifically to the Conservative Party of Canada? And secondly, what, I guess, encouraged you, or who encouraged you to put your hat in the ring, so to speak, for the nomination in Calgary Signal Hill?
Well, in a certain sense, I have a similar story to Sabrina. Since we both work in media, you both observe how other people run campaigns, what issues people run, and how they talk about stuff. And after a while, I think by just observing the landscape and the sort of people who get into politics, you look around, you're like, I could do a better job here, because at the end of the day, people can run on how long their resumes are and whatnot, and how much experience they've had in and outside of government. But unless you're willing to be a maverick on some of the issues, not being disruptive, but taking on an issue and really pushing it downfield to get some movement on it. Like, I think Sabrina deserves a lot of credit for Pierre Poilievre coming out today in favor of significantly reducing immigration rates, because she was probably one of the only people running for a nomination and in the media who was openly saying that the Conservative Party should be running on this. So that's great, but that proves that in a certain sense, what you want in a big tent party, and this is why I'm attracted to a big tent party, is that you're supposed to have large, big scale, like wide ranging discussions on the policy issues, where even if the Conservatives have a majority government, we still are having internal, not battles, but we're having internal competitions of ideas between different individuals. And we craft our policy based on being able to make compromises or potentially consensuses on different issues. So when I had jumped into the race, I actually started door knocking in my riding the first time. I was the most nervous person on the planet when I first went out. It was December of 2022. Ron Liepert hadn't even said he wasn't going to be running again. I hadn't even heard word he wasn't going to be running again. It was just a guess on my behalf. So I was even having to tell people I just don't think that he's going to run. So I'm seeing if anyone's interested in a new, younger, more orthodox conservative type candidate. And from my initial interactions with constituents and from talking with some people behind the scenes, it was all very encouraging. And then from there, I slowly ramped up so that in about the last 10 months, 11 months, we were like pretty much door knocking every day or at least a few times a week.
Now, Sabrina, when you first announced that you were running, it seemed that you were sort of like the conservative darling. Like there was a graphic up for the Conservative Party. People were talking about it, that, because you were a known name in media. So when did you start noticing that change and that shift in your nomination? And can you tell us what sort of problems arose after you announced that you were running?
Yeah, I felt supported at the beginning, but one thing I really want to point out is I never asked to be a preferred candidate. I never asked for any sort of special treatment. All I ever talked to the party about before I ran was this truly going to be an open and fair nomination? And if they wanted to acclaim someone else or they preferred someone else very strongly and were going to tip the scales, just let me know. Like, I'm not someone who absolutely needs to run. I want to run, but I'm not going to jump in if you don't want me at all. And they said over and over again, this would be an open and fair process. So that's what I jumped into it believing. Probably the first indication was when one of my competitors, Kostas Menegakis, who is a former MP from the Harper years and has run 3 times since for the party, but has unfortunately lost all those times. He needed a waiver to be able to run in a nomination again because he had lost so many times. I had heard pretty strongly prior to my deciding to run in that riding that type of waiver would not be given this time around. About 2 weeks after I announced, I heard from the grapevine he had, in fact, received that waiver, which came as quite a bit of a shock. And then from there was just increasing, I would say, signals that the party preferred another candidate, that I was certainly not the preferred candidate. There were moves made behind the scenes to dry up some of the support I had from MPs in terms of coming out to knock doors with me. And I had worked hard on those relationships. That was never given to me by the party, certainly. When I had offered to come out to volunteer, for example, other by-elections, I was basically told not to come. We have enough volunteers. So I was being isolated behind the scenes as well. But where it really changed is when my campaign found evidence that actual rules were being broken in terms of the nomination process. So this went beyond, just putting your finger on the scale or, some borderline behind the scenes bullying. This was actually giving updated lists to a competitor who was then using those lists to send around anonymous smear emails and saying you're going to launch an investigation, but there being no evidence that there ever was an investigation. At the same time, we're pretty certain that one of my competitors knew when the nomination was going to be closed, which no one's supposed to know because they were telling their supporters the date, which got back to me and ended up being that date. Once rules begin to be broken, how can you have any faith in the integrity of the nomination process? Because ultimately how people get updated lists is one of 2 ways. It's coming through the EDA or it's coming through party headquarters. And both of those entities are involved in, again, setting the actual vote date, the voter lists, seeing do people live in the riding, do these names match, counting the votes. So at that point, when they're willing to break rules to make sure someone has a big advantage, how far are they willing to go? At which point I felt I had to come out and say something, because it wasn't so much only that it wasn't, fair to my campaign, but I felt it most importantly wasn't fair to the voters of the riding who felt that they were going to have an open and fair nomination process. And it wasn't fair to my team. We had volunteers, donors. How can you continue to ask people to sacrifice and give to something that really is a rigged process?
See, this one's really fascinating to me because in this case, in this specific riding, right? Like I mentioned, we were, as an organization right now, supporting a different candidate who eventually won the nomination, being Kostas Menegakis. And yes, he had ran 3 times previously and lost in each of those times, being 2015, 19, and 2021. Although I think all 3 were talking by like 150 or 300 votes. Like, he's always been really, really close. And he did need the waiver. Now, when we found out that he was running for the nomination, and we saw that you were running for the nomination as well, we were quite convinced there's no way he's going to get the waiver because they want Sabrina. And we thought one of the reasons why, and by they, we mean people close to the leader and maybe the leader himself, one of the reasons we thought that the very tight inner leadership circle wanted you was because I think it was in late February. There was an event at the Albany Club in Albany Club or Canadian
A Canadian
Economic
club.
the Canadian Club, thank you. And it was sponsored. One of the sponsors for it was correct me on the title. It was something like the future of Canadian conservatism or something like that. And then they had 5 young conservatives, and you were one of the 5 panelists. And one of the sponsors of this event was JB and Associates, Jenny Byrne and Associates, her firm, who of course is the national director for the national campaign for the Conservative Party of Canada for the upcoming general federal election in 2025, and was the campaign manager for the Pierre Poilievre leadership campaign. So we thought, okay, well, this is the favored candidate. And maybe at that time you felt that, and maybe you didn't. But that's when Costas had received the waiver, which of course we were happy that he did receive the waiver. We thought, okay, well, that's different. Like, what does this signal to us? Because why would JB and Associates sponsor an event with a candidate who's running in this nomination, and then all of a sudden the executive director of the party, because that's who, I believe it's executive director of the party and the president and national council together for waivers for those who have lost at least 2 previous elections or 2 elections in the past. Got the waiver. We thought, okay, like, is there like an internal struggle within the leadership group or something like that? But that to us was kind of the first, like, oh, this is an interesting switch.
Well, and think about how pathetic this is in general, that we're all sitting around wondering, well, who in the background, who nobody elected, likes the candidate that's running in this race? And now, even in a certain sense, people are now going to be discussing, oh, did someone in the back end of the party just sour on Sabrina? Rather than she was just running in a legitimate race and just some other people actually came out from on high to then select somebody else. And what I literally got a phone call just before we went on today, and somebody had said that it was specifically a senator who was favoring Costas and was demanding that basically some amount of leeway be given to him. And as a pro-life conservative myself, in a certain sense, I'd rather have people in caucus who disagree with me on the issue but want to have open nominations and open discussion, rather than someone who's pro-life who knows that they might have not won their nomination unless someone came in and gave it to them.
Well, this is the thing I was going to say too, because like for our organization's perspective, right, we want to know like how strong we are or are not in specific ridings. So, you know, if Sabrina and Costas are going up in a campaign where, you know, everything for the most part, ideally completely, is on the level, you know, like the waiver, the not waiver, like, the thing about the waivers, which is interesting to me, so for those that you don't know that are watching, there are various waivers that the executive director of the Conservative Party of Canada, typically in conjunction with the president of National Council, can give out to specific candidates for various reasons. So, for example, there is a waiver that exists for people who want to run for the Conservative Party of Canada but have not been a member for the last 90 days. These are typically people who come from, you know, municipal politics or provincial politics where, you know, there isn't a provincial Conservative Party
or Liberals,
a federal party, or former Liberals. Yeah, in some cases, there's waivers, shockingly enough, for people who can't get 25 signatures of party members in the riding. I know that has been given out to certain candidates. And I've also heard, of course, I can't confirm this, right? So now we're getting a little bit of a rumor mill, but I have heard that there have been waivers issued for candidates to not have a criminal background check, which is a huge red flag to me.
I know the candidate who's gotten all 3 of those.
Yeah. And so like, if you're going to dish out waivers, you know, like there should be, I would think, at least some sort of predictability to it. Now there's another former pro-life member of parliament who's wanting to run for a nomination in an upcoming by-election, and he can't get a waiver because he ran in a nomination in this cycle for a previous by-election and didn't win it. So like it's kind of like very haphazard. It's very random. But all I'll say is this, is that from my perspective as someone who's the president and co-founder of a political pro-life organization, I want to know if Kostas Managakis is going up against Sabrina Maddeaux in the riding of Aurora, Oak Ridge, Richmond Hill for the Conservative nomination. if you, Sabrina, get out there and you sold, more memberships and you got more of them out to the nomination to vote for you and we lost that way, well, I want to know that, because that tells us like, hey, we got to go and increase our numbers of supporters in that riding so that that doesn't happen again. And I also want to know, like, oh, like if Costas wins this nomination by X amount, then hey, it looks like we're doing our job, and that's another one in the W column. So for me specifically, and I would hope that pro-lifers out there would also agree with this. Like, we want a fair and open nominations, because we want to know in reality where do we sit from our specific perspective on our specific issues in the various ridings right across Canada, specifically within the Conservative Party of Canada. Now, Wyatt, you had a not quite the same experience, because you were actually, I believe the technical term is disallowed by the National Candidate Selection Committee, and then your appeal to National Council. So like you said, you were out there, I'm sure like you were, Sabrina, too, right? Knocking on doors, selling. I know you were, Sabrina, because I was following you on social media, right? So Wyatt, you were doing the same. You were knocking on doors, selling memberships. You had a team together. In fact, Wyatt, I think it's fair to say, specifically for you, you had quite the coalition of people behind you in the riding, and you sold a rather large number of memberships, which is
it's hard to ballpark in this riding since it's such a saturated area. So I know in Aurora Oak, that riding ended up with like 2,000 members when it cut off. There's about 2,100 members in Signal Hill at all times. So there's 4,900 members on the official list now that I've heard. And I had anywhere from really low balling at 800 all the way up to 1,100, 1,200 people who either I sold brand new memberships to, we had renewed, or they were long-term members who were then supporting us. So in a riding that should have had actually seven candidates, we were very competitive, because there's actually a third man in Calgary Signal Hill who was disallowed because he wasn't granted a waiver, where he had just not submitted his application basically like an hour late, just forgot to hit submit, and they wouldn't give him a waiver. And the idea is that they don't really, and the funny thing is, I don't think they really had a personal problem with Leela here or myself or this other man. They just wanted the ridings, like competition shaved down, because the person that's favored in the riding, and it's just obvious it's Jeremy Nixon, that they want him to basically be able to win. And what he needs is he can't have big personalities in the race near him, like Leela A here, who is very much more on the center left kind of lane of the party, and I'm more on the orthodox conservative side of the party, whereas he doesn't really fill a lane, so he needed the people who had like strong draws in certain areas to be removed, and then maybe he can just outwork the other his other opponents, who are mostly kind of in that more gray in the middle UCP kind of generic CPC lane.
Yeah. So I guess maybe you could walk through us the timeline for you, Wyatt, kind of like what Sabrina did. Were there any warning signs that you were kind of feeling leading up to your disallowance? Were you at all surprised? And then Sabrina, maybe we can come back to you, because I'm curious to hear your opinion as to why, like what the reasoning is, why you think like the supporters that were encouraging of you, I'm going to, I guess, kind of from late autumn through Christmas until the beginning of this year, why that all started to dissipate and melt away first.
Yeah, so when I started, like, obviously, when I first started door knocking in like December of 2022, that was when I was mostly kind of kicking tires. I started moving a little bit like faster in sort of July of 23, announcing that I'm running to my audience on my YouTube channel, which is like a decent group of people. Every episode I release could have hundreds to some episodes even have had thousands of people from the riding itself watching the show. So there was some good reach there. So door knocking like pretty much every day starting in August. And then what I had started noticing was that there was a lot of campaigns who, like, let's be fair, everyone can get lists. Everyone knows how to get lists. It's not difficult. It just depends on if that looks like cheating or not. I mostly got lists through third-party organizations who were supportive of me. And I started noticing that there must be some people who have a lot of friends in the background, because they were, when I would go door knocking in a giant crescent, 86 houses or so, you'd only notice that one or two houses had even seen another candidate, because certain other candidates must have gotten a hold of a list from Aaron O'Toole's leadership campaign or Pierre Poilievre's leadership campaign. So they're not using the official list, but they're using basically the roadmap to going and renewing old members. I was door knocking every single door I came across. actually trying to expand the party's appeal, I would sign up people who are NDP supporters and liberal supporters, because I was the first one to actually articulate how parental rights works using center-left language. Or I was the first person to say, hey, we need to actually reduce immigration. I'd have people saying, oh, I'm a center-left voter. I don't like that kind of right-wing stuff. And I would say, well, we need to reduce immigration probably like 2/3 to get control of housing price and rent costs. And they're like, oh goodness, someone's finally saying it. So like I was actually, maybe I'm just such a fool for actually going out there and talking to voters. But when I started noticing other people had an oddly easy time of targeting the exact doors of members, that's when I knew that people were getting updated lists. And then I even know that there was 37 members. This is just one instance. 37 people who bought memberships. They had never had a party membership in their lives. They mostly never voted before. They, within 4 hours of buying their memberships, had campaigns emailing them and trying to call them. So other campaigns, within 4 hours, they were getting emails from Jeremy Nixon's campaign, even though these people had never been members of anything, unless they stole like the list from wherever church or religious organization they go to. There would have been no way of being able to contact these individuals that quickly.
I want to jump in and say that was the issue in my riding as well, is that it was updated lists. And my campaign knew that because, like Wyatt, members we had sold to who were, for example, former Liberals and had never in any way been involved in the Conservative Party, not at events, not as donors, not as members, certainly, were suddenly their personal emails. We're getting emails from, well, anonymous people claiming they were members in the riding, even though those people didn't exist, and also getting knocks at their doors from other campaigns in a way that wasn't random or bulk canvassing. It was very targeted. So getting those updated membership lists is a huge violation of the rules and a huge advantage as well for one campaign to have.
We live in a world that grows through communication.
Every connection comes from a dream to be heard and realized.
To welcome a better future. What are your dreams?
LaRosse Media will help communicate your vision through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Start building connections to your future audience. Visit larossemedia.com
and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.
Okay, so like there's no doubt in my mind that these things happen, and probably worse than you even know, I assume. But I mean, like, did you both go into this thinking, I know this happens to other people, but it would never happen to me? Because like Garrett Van Dorlen, that was just a huge blow up. Like the president of the EDA quit, the vice president, they outwardly said that there was a favored candidate. They helicoptered in, Arpan into the riding from Brampton, disqualified Garrett after he sold like over 1,000 memberships. Parm Gill, same situation. Yeah, Parm Gill, same situation. There was articles about this in the Toronto Star and the Hill Times. So like, we knew that these things were happening. Also, like, Jenny Byrne is not new to politics. We know kind of how she operates from the Harper years. So, like, was it surprising to you that this stuff happened? Did you guys just think, okay, we have enough connections, we have enough relationships with people, we don't think this will happen? Or did you think, like, oh, the party assured us it wouldn't happen, so therefore, like, were you surprised at all based on, like, what's happened previously in the last, year when it comes to these goings-on in the nomination process?
I was assured, and maybe probably by the same person Sabrina was assured by. I haven't asked if you were given any assurances, but I was assured by an MP very close to the inner circle of the Conservative Party leadership that this is a riding that the party would never dare disqualifying someone from unless they were like found to be living, 100 miles away from the area, and they'd run for the Liberals before, or anything like that, anything that's obviously, unbecoming of a candidate for any party. You've committed a crime. And so I was guaranteed that. And now there are 3 people who have been removed from a race, which this riding used to be Stephen Harper's riding when he was a Reform MP, then it was Rob Anders' riding. It's like the blue suburban riding for conservatives. This is the riding where even when you have like nightmare polls coming out for like Alberta, the provincial riding that's within this area is, even if like the NDP like are like 10 points, 15 points above, this is still like the one blue square in the area. This is the conservative riding. So I was even shocked that they did this, because I'm thinking, like, why would you want to alienate donors in your big donor like riding? This is a riding where like I'm getting tired of walking up people's palatial staircases up to their doorsteps, and for some reason they're like that. It would be unthinkable to want to have this riding come under disrepute. Like I was always thinking, to a certain extent, that's an Eastern Canada thing. That's kind of like the way that Patrick Brown and Doug Ford very much corrupted the nomination system in Ontario. But in Alberta, it's unthinkable. You don't go to the heartland and then start sort of pulling some backroom political tactics off.
Yeah, I would say similar things, that I had received, as I said before, assurances from multiple people within the party that this would be an open and fair nomination. So having had asked that multiple times beforehand, obviously I was probably a bit naive to believe the answers that I got. And while I was certainly aware of the situation in Oxford before, I guess I underestimated how blatant certain people could be about how hard they would press on the scales, and also the extent to so flagrantly breaking the rules and refusal to do anything about it. That came as a bit of a surprise. And then how widespread and common this is. After I publicly suspended my campaign, I was contacted by literally dozens of other candidates and former candidates from across the country in all types of jurisdictions, from all different parts of the big blue tent, who had very similar experiences recently. And that shocked even me. And of course, then connecting with Wyatt and hearing his story as well. So my case is certainly not an isolated incident, and how widespread it is I think disturbing, both on a Democratic front, but also for the long-term future of the party, because I think that the way nominations are being run might have some short-term benefits for the current people in power, but I think in terms of long-term benefit and winning elections, another 4 years out, 8 years out, that this could be quite detrimental.
We'll just look at
that's so interesting. You meant that was so interesting that Sabrina mentioned that, because I do want to get to that, and I think that's a perfect segue into kind of the next thing what I want to talk about. So I think for people who are friends of mine and who watch this podcast, it's not a surprise that I'm not a huge Pierre Poilievre fan. I really especially don't like the people, not all, but a lot of the people that he has surrounded himself with in particular. Like how some people suffer from Trudeau derangement syndrome or Trump derangement syndrome. I think I suffer from Poilievre derangement syndrome. All that being said, like, yeah, I of course would like to see most, if not all, of the Liberal, NDP, and Bloc and Green members of Parliament replaced by, I would say, good Conservative members of Parliament. Sure. But do you think that, first off, how pervasive do you think this type of attitude and behavior, I would even say insider gatekeeping, is within the Conservative Party of Canada? And, like, it's great for the party's perspective that they're, 15, 20 points ahead in the polls. We got 18 months till Election Day. It's going to be October 19, 2025. I don't think there's going to be, come hell or high water, like I highly, highly doubt that there's going to be anything that changes that. I think the Liberals need all the time that they can get. I don't think the NDP can actually afford to go to an election, because the way they fund their elections is they always put the building that they own their headquarters in, the Jack Layton building in downtown Ottawa on Bank. They always put that up for remortgage, and that's how they get the cash. So they can't be doing that every 2 years. They need more time. Do you think that this pervasive attitude of insider gatekeeping is detrimental for the upcoming election in 2025? And should the Conservatives win, let's say, a majority government, do you think that the effects of this are going to be, like, how detrimental do you think it would be for the party going into government?
I don't think they could have. Oh, you go first.
Thanks. I think it's very detrimental in that we're not electing the strongest candidates when we don't have open and fair nominations, and the people who would be the strongest in a general election at campaigning or representing people in parliament or growing to be future leaders of the party as well. We're just nominating favorites. And in many cases, I'd say candidates that have a long proven history of being loyal to certain people, to not speaking up, to not causing waves, who will just sit there in the backbench if need be and nod their heads. And I think the perspective of some people right now is the party's so far ahead by 20 points that it doesn't really matter who the candidates are, because Pierre's going to win the election, probably by a large amount. But what happens then 4 years from now when we need to win another election? And maybe the polls are quite different by then. And especially in some of these swing ridings, you need that candidate who has broader appeal, who can campaign, who has name recognition because they've been a good member of parliament and are good communicators. I don't know what happens then. These ridings might be lost again very, very quickly. And I think we have a generational opportunity to really have, a decade of power here as conservatives. But unfortunately, the actions that are being taken right now might put that into jeopardy.
Clapping seals and bobbleheads. That's what we like to say.
I'm going to say that, if the Conservative Party wants to fuel a Justin Trudeau comeback narrative, they will keep doing what they're doing when it comes to nominations. Like, Poilievre's making the right policy moves and saying that, yes, we need to significantly reduce immigration. We need to get control of this policy here, that policy there. But the problem is if anything bad happens for the Conservative Party that gives them a bad image in the next year and a half, you actually want stronger individual candidates in their own areas who can actually gird up those ridings. They're interesting because the thing is that this is why I hate political consultants so much. They believe that the way that you win an election is through pure risk management. You risk manage yourself into a victory, which is not how it works. So right now, they think we have a 20-point lead. Now we have to defend our 20-point lead. The problem is when all you're doing is defense, and this is what all the nominations shenanigans are kind of about. One, it's getting friends in, and then two, it's getting compliant, safe people in. It means that the best you can do in a day is not lose ground. The worst you can do is lose everything you have. And so when we see polls coming out from Nanos that show that the Liberals are only down on the Conservatives by 12 points, might be an outlier poll, also might not be. So what you might want to not do is start pumping the brakes now. And also when you have nomination candidates who are effectively, their entire background is that for 20 years or so, they've been compliant. They've been nice. They've been polishing, picture frames in other people's offices, that when the Conservatives form government, when they form a majority, what are the chances that we might end up having it be that policy becomes slow? It's hard to get things through. You have people who are making up the government's caucus and cabinet who are very risk averse. And now Poilievre, who himself is genuinely a maverick on a lot of issues, he's having to do everything himself because you're going to have a lot of people terrified to say anything because their entire training is about being terrified, saying nothing, and hoping that eventually somebody gives you the nod to run when you've never actually converted a single person to being a conservative. That's actually the wild thing in my riding. Again, Jeremy Nixon, one, doesn't even live in the riding. He lives up in the Northeast. And in his area of Klein, where he used to be the MLA for 4 years, he's run in that area 5 times. Once he ran in Ward 10, which is basically the entire area municipally. And then he ran 4 times provincially, 2 times as Wild Rose, 2 times as UCP. Only won once off the back of Jason Kenney. And now you're going to give him a strong, safe, conservative riding. Yeah, you're not going to lose it this cycle, but if you want to turn a safe riding red, you're going to put someone in there that makes them question, why do I even vote conservative? Because this guy doesn't actually stand for conservatism. I'm going to go, just stay home. Maybe I'll vote Liberal because at least their candidate's nice and outgoing and charismatic, or I'm going to go vote PPC or whatever else.
Oh man, I could talk for the rest of the podcast about this topic because it's so important. I don't even know where to start, but even in your riding of Calgary Signal Hill, do they just think that conservative voters are stupid? Because how can you disqualify a former UCP MLA in favor of another former UCP MLA?
Their voting records are the exact same too. Leela has a reputation for being more liberal on issues. Nixon has the same record as her. He actually was the one who killed a bill to protect the conscience rights of doctors. Leela just talked about it. He was on the committee and voted alongside the borderline communist Janice Irwin to get rid of it. Like his reasoning was also nuts. It was like, I believe in conscience rights, but not when they violate non-discriminatory access to healthcare. I'm like, that's what the point of conscience rights are, so you can discriminate against things you are willing and not willing to do.
And even in Sabrina's writing, like, we know for a fact that there are multiple former MPs who did not get waivers, but yet the one in her writing got a waiver. Like, there's absolutely zero consistency whatsoever. So do they just expect, like, us not to know or just to turn a blind eye? Because, like, it seems to me the end game is get rid of Trudeau. Like, we must get rid of Trudeau, get rid of Trudeau, get rid of Trudeau. But there's no, like, after game. Like, there's no talk about what's going to happen afterwards. And when you have spent the last 2 years pissing off conservatives one by one, EDA presidents and vice presidents quitting, speaking out in the news, not like getting ignored, former MPs getting ignored, like politicians provincially like getting disqualified, there has to be some ramifications. And I just feel like I'm living in a deja vu world because I lived in Toronto for 10 years prior to moving to Alberta, and I was there through the whole Patrick Brown fiasco, and he was doing the exact same thing. I would regularly be helping in nominations that were fully rigged. Like, there would be ballot stuffing. Like, I would see ballots stuck together at the nominations.
Yeah. They come in like the sticky pads, right?
Yeah,
and then
it was
we would because we would be scrutineering for different pro-life candidates running for PC of Ontario nominations, and they would dump they would dump the box, all the ballots come out, and then you see 9 of them stuck together. Like, it was super obvious.
It was crazy. And like, you kind of, I don't know if you guys were both at convention, but you're starting to see kind of the discontent at the convention, because during the constitutional outbreak rooms, we were trying to pass different policies that would make the grassroots stronger and
protect people like Wyatt and Sabrina from things like this in the Constitution.
The chair who was running the meeting would just blatantly, like, it was hilarious, say that motions were passed or failed when the whole room was clearly on the other side. Like, they were just calling it the way the party wanted to and not based on, like, the paddles. Like, it wasn't even like you had to do a vote count because it was close. It was like 10 people put up a yay and, like, the rest put up a nay, and they were like, oh, motion passed. Like, it was just ridiculous. So, and the room started to get so rowdy, and even an MP stood up and, like, yelled at the chair for not calling the votes correctly, and then he started to like pretend to do it a bit better. But I mean, you see that at convention, you see this happening with the nominations. Everybody's obsessed with getting rid of Trudeau, so we all have to be a team player. Like, I've even seen people who have been disqualified still be kind of sycophantic for the Conservatives and for, Pierre. But there has to be some outcomes. Like, look at what happened to Patrick Brown. Maybe it won't happen to that same extent, but there's a lot of, I think, underlying discontent happening, and will only continue to happen if there isn't specifically fair and open nominations. I know that's not a question. It's just my.
I know a couple things here though. Like the ironic thing is right now. And people are trying to like honestly, like Sabrina can probably attest to this. The gaslighting is crazy after all this goes down, of people treating you like you did something wrong. But the party right now is living vicariously through an O'Toole era rule where they don't have to tell you the reasons for kicking you out. They are not even that they don't have to. They will not tell you. So if they kick someone out for a good reason, they were actually cheating, or they kick someone out because they don't like their face, those two scenarios look the exact same. But we know exactly what ends up happening if you do this for too long, and it's happening right now in the United Kingdom with Rishi Sunak's Conservative Party getting absolutely destroyed because they just assumed they risk managed their way through literally 14 years in government, and now nobody's happy with them at all because they haven't actually done anything. Because whenever action is considered more of a risk than doing nothing, eventually you will end up getting destroyed from your own inaction. And so but to go back to the gaslight, it's crazy how you'll let some people just let the party get away with this because people can't separate the leader from the party. You can like Polyev, I like Polyev, but what you can't do, and I've had people literally take on this Soviet attitude that well, you were kicked out, you must have done something wrong. Well, Stalin wouldn't have had someone executed unless they were a traitor. Like, it's like legitimately stuff like this where people are coming at me. I had people saying, well, Wyatt was was a liberal, and that's why they probably got rid of him. You get a lot
I
of
saw
liberals
that on Twitter. And they said, yeah.
I had one person say something along the lines of that I didn't live in the riding. I've literally lived here my entire life. I am the candidate who's been in the riding the longest.
And they said to you, Sabrina, or I've heard through, social media, and I think it was even in some articles, that the reason why you're speaking out now is because you only sold 50 memberships.
Which was not true, first of all. We sold many more than that and had support from existing members. And also why I came out, like, it would have been a lot easier if I did think I was going to lose quietly. We actually thought we were going to be very competitive had it actually been an open and fair nomination, rather than come out and go through the whole media and the gaslighting that Wyatt spoke about. That was not a fun couple of weeks. It was a very painful and stressful few weeks. But I felt having the platform that I had to do that. The other thing people would say was, oh, well, why didn't you just go through to election day just in case? Well, I think you can only really come out and tell the story I did before that. Because if you go through and you lose because it's a rigged election, then they're going to paint you as a sore loser, which is what they tried to do anyways. But then there would have been a lot more there for them to go on. But it was an interesting experience for sure to see how the party reacted afterwards, that they were able to come out to media and frankly lie to them, but never managed to say the word investigation in public or give any of the next steps, which is, of course, which I came out asking for. But I was at the point where that didn't surprise me very much at all.
The dumbest point I heard against Sabrina was on a podcast where, like, you can tell there are some things, and this is where my publication, the National Telegraph, and everything I do, I've never been a front group for anybody. You get some publications and some outlets and individuals who effectively act as fronts for parties, and this goes on in literally every party. Even the PPC does this. Even the PPC people kick their candidates out of nominations to install a different person. But on a podcast, they were saying, well, Sabrina, you have to sell even if she sold 300 memberships, you have to sell like 2,000 to be competitive in a nomination. There was only 2,000 memberships in the whole nomination. This isn't 2006 where you can walk around with $1,000 and just say, don't worry, your membership's already bought for you. Like, this isn't 2000 with Art Hanger in Calgary Northeast where there was 15,000 registered members. This is an era where you actually need to purchase your own membership. Somebody, like one of the guys who was not granted the waiver in my riding, I think he had sold like 350 or so memberships, but those were like brand new memberships. That's actually really good, considering that those people will go exactly where he wants them to. He connected with them, sold them a paper membership, they bought it themselves. That's really good. And that's the problem for my competitors like Jeremy Nixon. He only had soft support because he's just going around and renewing old people. And I would even have to describe him to voters at their door because he was in the area just like a week before me. I'd have to describe what the different candidates look like so they could even remember the man who was there 5 days before, because they pressured them into renewing, hey, I'm from the party and I'm trying to make sure that you can vote in this nomination. Did that, walked away. They didn't even know who he was. And actually, this is a point that I think, Alissa, you brought up way at the beginning, but that or Sabrina, that there was candidates who knew when the nomination date was dropping. They knew when the membership cutoff was. That seemed to be the same for mine. I didn't know when the date was, but a reason why they might have wanted to get rid of me was I was one of the only candidates when they called the membership deadline for only 48 hours away. I had a phone bank. We had robocalls set up. We had a big email list all jacked into MailChimp so that we could send out emails to everyone. We had live phone callers. We had everything. Whereas a lot of other campaigns, they were flat-footed from no fault of their own. They were basically surprised, and they were going to set up the stuff when the announcement was maybe made and say, oh, in a week and a half, there's going to be a membership cutoff then, and they can set up all this infrastructure. And so I think they got mad, or they were like scared that I actually had what was a credible campaign that could win. And so they needed to, cut my brakes out from under me. And then even Jeremy got the lists 12 days before the other candidates who weren't disqualified were able to get them. One other candidate, Michael Kim, also got the list, but obviously you have to give it to two candidates. You can't just give it to one guy, or that's supremely sketchy.
I want to ask a question of both of you, but beforehand, Sabrina, I just want to come back to a question I asked of you earlier, because I don't know if I got an answer. And if you're not comfortable answering, that's fine. Don't feel pressure to. But I am curious because we heard from Wyatt what he thinks his reasoning is, or the reason, not his reasoning, but he thinks he knows what the reasoning is as to why he was disqualified. I'm really curious to know from you what you think the reasoning is as to why that support that seems so warm and welcoming and whatever adjective you want to use dissipated. And then secondly, for both of you, given that this podcast is, going to go out there and you've both are media people and you've been in the media already, both of you, on kind of what's happened in your ridings, have either or both of you experienced any friendships, professional relationships, whatever you want to call it, to people within the Conservative Party of Canada, whether it be, members of the office leader of the opposition or people that work for the Conservative Party of Canada or specific organizers or people like that have, I don't know, kind of distanced you or ostracized you, I suppose. Like and if that has happened, in your estimation, is it worth the cost to have a discussion like this? Because I think it's fair to say that for all of us on this podcast, and for most people who are listening, they ideally would like to see a Conservative Party of Canada that sticks to its constitution, both in letter and spirit, to have open and fair nominations, to have open and fair elections for National Council and EDAs and things of this nature, because in this country with the Westminster parliamentary system, you do need those bigger tent parties. That goes for the Liberals as well, in order to actually be competitive, not just in one election campaign where you have a tired government after 10 years, but in election campaigns going forward, especially if you actually want to do something significant. So sorry, that's a really, really long preface for what should be two simple questions. But Sabrina, I want to start with you as to why you think there was that change, I will dare say, within the party leadership as to why they went cold on you.
I think it was a couple things, but one major theme was that the climate changed from the time that I first started talking to the party about running to when I actually announced my campaign and through that. So when I first started talking to them, the polls were still very, very close. And again, I was running in a swing riding. Like I think you mentioned before, it's been lost by like less than 1,000 votes, a couple hundred votes the last few times around. So having a very strong candidate who can communicate, who can also, I think, for the national brand, represent a bit of a different type of face and demographic, and who has name recognition, was very appealing at that point in time, where it didn't look for sure like the Conservatives were going to win next time around, or certainly not get a majority or a supermajority. That said, by the time I actually announced, the Conservatives were then leading by 20 points in the polls. So at that point, I think certain people in party headquarters and who advise it from outside of it decided they wanted a different type of candidate. It no longer mattered about having the strongest candidate. It mattered about having the most compliant, low risk candidates. Because again, if you're going to win no matter what, you want someone then who's easy to control and practically guaranteed to not cause you any problems, even though I never gave them any indication of not being a team player or that I would cause problems. My announcement also went really, really well, even better than I thought it would, and I think better than they thought it would. My announcement video racked up basically 500,000 views within 12 hours, got coverage in media outlets across the country, from every side of the political spectrum. And I think some people saw that as a threat as well, because if you have a voice, if you have an independent power base, also I was able to fully fundraise above and beyond the spend limit for nominations within 2 weeks. I didn't need any party help fundraising. I didn't need any party help with them sending me volunteers. We had dozens of volunteers off the bat coming from within the riding and outside the riding. So when you have that sort of independence and you don't owe anyone anything and you don't have any strings that they can pull, that becomes a threat. And again, when you feel you're going to win no matter what, why, put up with that threat? Why not just shove it to the side? And it's interesting because you also mentioned the Canadian Club event, which a lot of people mention. I had actually worked with Canadian Club for a long time prior to that. I'd moderated panels for them and been on panels and was also good friends with that event organizer. So I was asked to be a part of that completely separate of Jenny Byrne and Associates or anyone from the party. The MPs were organized separately. So I don't know at what point any of the sponsors actually found out I was going to be on that panel. But interestingly, the last thing someone from the party told me before I stepped up on that stage was, this is a direct quote, "Don't say anything stupid." And I think that says a lot about the attitude in terms of they just want people who will say, the 4 lines that they've been given, and then the next 4 lines, and then will sit and nod rather than advocate for change. And I've been very clear throughout my career that I'm willing to speak up on issues and for what I believe is right, forcefully. And that's what I pitch to voters, but that's maybe not what's wanted in this current party environment.
So so Sabrina, because you went through this experience and you feel, I think with some justification, especially from things I've heard, that things were not all on the level for that riding. And from what I was hearing, things weren't on the level basically the entirety of that time, of that nomination for that riding. And because you've gone public about it, do you feel that either friendships or professional relationships you've had with people, maybe in the OLO, Party HQ, people involved within the leadership circle, do you feel that those have been frayed? Have you been told like you're now anathematized, you're ostracized? Have you paid a price, so to speak, to shine a little sunlight to hopefully disinfect this, I would say, really poisonous attitude that's in the party right now?
Since I announced that I was suspending my campaign, I have not heard a single word from anyone from party headquarters, from MPs, from anyone, associated in that bubble, which I expected. That doesn't come as a surprise to me. But at the same time, there have been a lot of supporters who respect what I did. And I'd say especially voters within the riding. I'm still having dinners with volunteers. I'm going to the riding again on Tuesday to a couple members that I signed up want to have me up there, and we're going to sit down and have a conversation about what happened. And in that regard, that's very encouraging that people who are actually grassroots and, care about nominations and having strong candidates, those people have still been very supportive. I think that those who are closer to the inner power circles of the party and have future positions and careers at stake are scared to be anywhere near me at this point in time. So I'm definitely a bit of a black sheep in that way. That doesn't come as a surprise, though, and it's worth it. I'm glad that everything I did, because I truly do believe that democracy and open and fair nominations are important if you say you're going to have open and fair nominations. From my perspective, I wasn't, a lifetime political staffer or someone who worked in government relations or who always needed to be elected. So taking that hit for me is okay, to know that I did the right thing and stood up for what I believe in. I can go continue my career in other places, whether that's media or something else. I don't know what that's going to be yet. But I think that's part of also why I was able to come out in a way others haven't, because I'm not living or dying on whether I can run for the Conservative Party again in another cycle, right? So.
Sorry, Wyatt, you said it sounded like you had something you want to add.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in when she was talking about like wanting compliant people, and it's not like me or Sabrina were like advertising that we're going to be troublemakers and rock the boat or anything. It would be like the type of thing that if I was ever like, the way it was intimated to me was that they want somebody that if they need to water down or just ignore a promise, that are not going to say anything about it. That was like the thing that was kind of disturbing. I actively had an MP tell me that you were too ambitious, which was like insane. It's like I've never been told I was overqualified for elected office before, but I guess there's that. But the thing is too, like I've also just experienced this like weird betrayal of people just pretending that you don't exist anymore. You've been unpersoned in many people's minds. There's other people super friendly. They maybe can't stick their neck out. Obviously, I get it, who have been giving me very friendly calls or emails. That's been very good. But you get other people who, they treat you like you've fallen from the sky down to the earth, and now they're not allowed to come back and speak to you at all. And it's what's worse is that if there was a legitimate reason to get rid of me, there would have actually been less people walking away from me. Like I had maybe said or done something that was legitimately wrong or whatever, or I had accidentally, I don't even know what, but like there was some sort of a real reason. They treat you worse because there's not a good reason. And to even acknowledge that you might so they almost have to like ramp up the temperature a little bit. So this is a little bit of behind the scenes stuff in the appeal that went on in my for my nomination. I was literally told by some people near National Council, I can't say if they're an assistant, staffer around their National Council themselves or whatever. It's just somebody nebulously out there, but it's very accurate information that the National Councilors didn't, in first the NCSC, the National Candidate Selection Committee, they didn't even know why they were told to vote against me and Leela. They were just told to. And then in the appeal, they had made a 9-page dossier on me to justify me not being able to get back into the race. And it was full of stuff. I'm not even kidding. These are direct quotes. Somebody took the ability to read it to me. And it was stuff like Wyatt follows pro-life groups on social media. Wyatt criticized the way Andrew Scheer and the Conservative Party ran the 2019 campaign, which I guess that was a perfect campaign. Apparently, that's why we won in 2019. But it was just full of stuff. One of the funniest ones, because people always say, well, they'll of course want you because you're like a neocon ghoul or whatever. I described myself as neoconservative in an interview. And one of the points was, people associate neoconservatism with George W. Bush, and people on the left and right don't like him. Like, what? It's just farcical nonsense. So what they really did was they cobbled together 9 pages of stuff. And when we say they, we all know the they that we're talking about. They might be associated with Jenny and Associates. But but they just wanted a 9-page document to make it look like, wow, there's so much stuff going against Wyatt. And you like read it and it's just generic descriptions of who I am as a person.
Nature communicates with us in a universal language. The sunrise starts a new day. The sunset marks our accomplishments.
The most beautiful communication is where the speaker and the listener match perfectly and understand the same message.
Your future audience is waiting to hear from you. What message do you need to share?
At LaRosse Media, we fashion beautiful communications through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Create your own most beautiful message. Visit larosmedia.com and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.
Well, I want to take this opportunity to just commend both of you guys for coming on and speaking about this because, like Sabrina said, like a lot of people who are disqualified or were told not to run don't want to do that. They don't. They still might want to run in the future, maybe under a different pretense or a different leader or whatever, or they're really relying on being a part of the party in some way. So, I really am happy that there are candidates that are speaking out about this because it is really important. And we're not doing this because we hate Poilievre and we hate the Conservative Party. We want them to lose. We're doing it because it's like you said, Sabrina, it's the right thing to do. Like we need to, at a very fundamental level as Conservatives, have fair and open nominations. And what makes me laugh the most is that, Sabrina, you say that you were assured multiple times by people of the members of the party who work for Poilievre that they wouldn't mess around in your nomination. But we don't have to take your word for it because you literally interviewed Pierre. You had the first interview, and I just want to read the direct quote because I just find it hilarious. He said, "We need open nominations and not just handouts of nomination tickets to favored friends," and then literally turned around and is not having open nominations and giving handouts to favored friends. So it's just, it's very unfortunate, and I'm really glad that there are people speaking out. And I think a lot of people, they say, oh, you're traitors, this is going to help the Liberals. But no, we just want a strong Conservative Party. We don't just want any Conservative Party, we want a strong Conservative Party. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not even kidding. I was instructed at one point by somebody to say, well, you should just tweet out, this has been a great experience and I've learned a lot. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to say that. And one, people wouldn't even believe I would say that. Even from this interview, people can probably tell I'm not that.
Where is Wyatt? Blink
Not the
twice.
type of a personality. But the other thing too is that when they're like the thing too is that what we see is like I actually kind of believe that Polyev believes that he wants open and fair nominations. The problem is that the party has him doing policy, like speeches, rallies, fundraisers all the time. And what we've run into is a situation where when when the cat's away, the mice are going to play. And there's people in the background of the party who, because nothing technically catastrophic is going down, our polling numbers aren't going down. So Polyev isn't having to check in on them, say, hey, what's going on? So while he's more absent and running the party from a policy standpoint, there are people doing the background management and now sort of molding it into their own image. The Conservative Party candidate in the riding of Toronto-St. Paul, if the Conservatives lose this riding, it's purely up to the people in the back room. Don Stewart is a former director of Jenny Burns and Associates. So you have to ask yourself, how did that guy get his nomination when it doesn't really seem like that should be your role if you're a lobbyist getting you think the Conservative Party would be bending over backwards to not have an association with lobbyists then being the candidates.
Mm-hmm. So there are still like tons of nominations that are going to happen over the next year. And I want to know from both of you, what kind of advice would you give to current nomination candidates who know or it's clear that they are not the favored candidate within the party? Would you advise them to keep going? Or would you just say keep going, but warn them? Or like what kind of advice would you give to them, to those who are listening and beyond?
That's really difficult to answer. I never want to discourage anyone from running or participating in a democratic process. That said, it's become pretty clear that if certain people surrounding or within the party decide they want or don't want a candidate, they're willing to go to pretty, strong lengths to make sure that that's what does or doesn't happen. So I think if you're running because, you really believe in issues and you want to contribute to the conversation and you're comfortable with knocking on doors and, rounding up volunteers and donations, and maybe you have to take time off work, just be aware of what's happened in other nominations, right? Because running is a huge sacrifice. It takes a lot of time, especially people who, give up jobs and you give up your social life and time with family and all these other sorts of things. So I think just you'd have to be very comfortable that you know what might happen at the end of the day. And I would also say that the more people who speak out about this type of internal interference, the more chance there is that something actually changes, because it comes down to members wanting to change the culture of the party and saying, we don't accept this, and voters not accepting it. So I encourage people to speak out. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to media. You can do it on your own social media feeds. But I really do think that can make a difference, and we're stronger in it together.
Well, I'd encourage, honestly, more people to run, run in an open, honest manner. Try your best. And the thing is, it's sort of like don't not run just because they could get rid of you. Shame on them if they get rid of you. But if you are genuinely feel like you're the best candidate for the job, you believe in, I would say, like the right conservative ideals, get in there. Like the thing is that too, I don't need every candidate to be like a perfect embodiment of what I would want. Like Sabrina, I would have loved to work with you in Parliament on the issue of immigration and housing, because you were probably the ideal person to be taking a lead role on a committee in some way of actually reviewing, immigration policy as well as, housing regulations and whatnot that go into local areas. That's what we want. If you think that you can have a very good effect on government in one area or multiple areas, that is kind of your niche, you are the ideal person to be taking that on, I'd say run. And the thing is that, maybe you'll end up getting kicked in favor of someone else. But again, that's shame on them for doing that. And then if you do get kicked out, don't feel afraid to speak out, because the fewer people who do that, the more often it can happen. This is what happens, again, in the UK. This is what happens right now frankly, in Ontario with the PC government there, is that they're riding high in the polls, but they're going to have a day, and maybe not the next election, but the next one after that, where they're going to wonder what happened when the party collapses. And it's because you didn't respect the people who were voting for you. You took them for granted and assumed your opposition was going to remain weak and pathetic. And then when they actually came back, you had nothing to show for the 8 years in government that you've had.
Well, in a similar vein too, like I was recently working with a couple other nomination candidates for Federal Conservative Party of Canada nominations, and one's about to announce and the other is already announced. And so typically, what we will do, and why this is something we did with you, for example, our whole goal is basically to build up as large of a database as we can in each and every federal and provincial riding. So then when a candidate comes around that we can support, we send out an e-blast, we send out a text blast saying like, hey, why is a pro-life candidate running in your riding for the Conservative Party of Canada nomination? We encourage you to take out a $15 1-year membership. Here's the link. Here's the link for Wyatt. And we'll say why, if you want to do any sort of follow-up, feel free to follow up with these supporters of ours. So I've had 2 candidates do that since, everything that went down with Sabrina, everything that went down with Wyatt, everything that went down with Garrett, which they still bring up, and rightfully so. Everything that's gone down even for sitting MPs like Arnold Viersen. And, for example, Sabrina, you could disagree with, Arnold on the specific topic of, let's say, abortion or something of that matter. But the heavy-handedness that the OLO dealt with their own caucus members, just absolutely shocking. It's something that you don't even really see in the Liberal Party of Canada. Like, I will say this, like, in the Liberal Party of Canada, they have 2 factions that are very, very divided on the issue of Israel and Gaza with Hamas. And you see MPs be able to speak their mind on both. Like, I know personally where I stand on the issue, but at least within there, like, I dare say these days it seems like that Liberal caucus has more freedom to speak their mind on a variety of issues compared to the Conservatives. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, in a similar vein, like what we're experiencing in our own database is people starting to shut off for this election. And this is something that we saw leading up to the general federal election in 2021, that pro-lifers were kind of the first part of that Conservative coalition to shut down. And then you had other different parts when Aaron O'Toole announced his non-carbon carbon tax, and the various flip-flops leading up to and during that campaign. So eventually, the gunnies got angry, and rightfully so, for the flip-flops during the campaign, and so on and so forth. I guess for both of you, what would be your message to either pro-lifers in specifically, but more generally just Conservatives who have been involved in the party in multiple ways, whether it's sitting on EDA boards, being members, voting in nominations, going to party policy conventions, knocking on doors, donating, and at the very least voting, who are just like, what, I'm done. Like this candidate that you sent me, Scott, they sound very supportive, and I hope they win and blah, blah, blah. But I am so done with the party, of everything that's happened. I don't want to get involved. I guess in addition to the message that you have for other candidates that want to run for nominations, what would be your message to not just pro-life Conservatives, but just Conservatives in general that just seem to now, at the very grassroots level, and this is kind of how it starts, start to kind of shut down and shut off and walk away a little bit?
So I'll take the to quote Rob Ford, the better of the Ford brothers, that if you're actually wanting to get something done and want change made, whether you're a candidate or you're just a voter, you got to wake up every morning, you got to pound the ball. And unless you're actually pounding the ball downfield, you're never actually going to, score. And so what we really need individuals to do, even if you're not running for office, I think what individual voters need to do is build your networks, build your own infrastructure. This is what I was telling young Conservatives when I spoke at the UCP convention for their youth wing, that don't just become a staffer, because becoming a staffer, if someone ever pulls the rug out from under you as a staffer, or they just decide that they just don't want to go in your direction if you ever want to run one day, you have nothing. You don't have any access to being able to get your own people gathered together to support you. Build your own social media pages, build your own YouTube channel, do something that's local that you can actually start. Even if you're just a voter and you want to support the right person, have a network of 12 people that you know in a riding, 12 households that you know in a riding, that you can mention a good candidate to, whether it's municipal, provincial, or federal, where I think everyone has to kind of turn into their own campaign manager rather than hoping that the infrastructure is going to drop in around them and the person they like and it's all going to go well. That's the one thing that Americans have over Canadians, is because we have this private club politics. Politics in Canada very much works like Tammany Hall in like the 1880s in New York, but because it's a private members club, people kind of only ever buy membership once every like 10 years to vote in something, then they don't do it again. There's always something to be involved in, and you don't have to become, an eccentric campaigner always wearing a political t-shirt and a hat, but you can just be somebody who map out in your own friend groups who's somebody who's on side, who lives in the same area or over there. I'm turning my campaign website, like wyattclaypool.com, into effectively how Charlie Kirk uses charliekirk.com. No matter where you are in the country, you can go sign up on my list, and if there's ever a nomination in your area, I'll let you know who's a good candidate, who I think is actually solid on some of the issues, either all of them, or at least they're very good on some specific ones. That's what I'm doing now. So even if you're rejected, you don't have to go sit in the corner. You just have to keep, wake up in the morning again and pound the ball downfield, even if you got shut down the first time.
I would echo much of that, in that I would say stay involved, find ways to be involved, to use your voice. Don't just give up or let your disillusionment or frustration get the best of you, as tempting as I can understand that to be. And I, heard similar things when I was knocking doors every day, that a lot of conservatives and even existing party members are just frustrated with the system in general and politics in general. And they say, oh, I'm out, I'm not voting for anyone anymore. And I would have these conversations with them about how, well, then you're never going to see change. And it might be really hard to trust a new candidate or a new politician. But if you're not willing to give people a chance and you're not willing to get involved, then again, nothing's ever going to change. And like Wyatt said, there are many ways to be involved, whether that's volunteering on a campaign, going out to make phone calls or knock on doors. You can get involved in community organizations, whether it's creating a database. There's so much you can do. And I also have a fear with a demographic that I'm very involved in, which is, the millennial voter and people concerned about affordability and generational fairness, that's another group that cares a lot about issues and is very passionate, but sometimes getting involved stops with making an angry tweet, or when something doesn't go their way, we're going to step back and we're not going to get involved and we're just going to give up and throw up our hands. You unfortunately can't do that. Participating is the only way to make change, and finding, like-minded people, and perhaps not always people that you agree with everything on, but that you can form a coalition with and advocate for values that you do agree on. And I think the beautiful thing about the Conservative Party in general is that this podcast is proving that, and that together we can make change. There is power in numbers.
Alissa, it sounds like to me that we have a couple fantastic speakers to go to the Yes Mic at the next party policy convention to speak toward our pro-grassroots constitutional amendments to ensure that there are open and fair nominations.
Well, if a red dot appears on my forehead while I'm speaking to that, just let me know.
Awesome. Well, we really want to thank you guys both for coming on the podcast, explaining your stories, telling, guiding people on what to do next. And it's such an important conversation. It needs to continue to be had as long as these things are happening. And we just have to hold the party to a greater standard so that, people can run without the threat of being disqualified or a rigged election like it was in Ontario many years ago. So we really appreciate you both for coming on. Thank you so much. Is there anywhere that people can, why don't you guys give your websites and any contact information or anything that you want to direct people to check out more about what you're doing?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate this discussion. Like I said, I think it's so important for people all over the tent to be talking about this and keeping it in the headlines and in the national conversation, because that's the only way we see change. People can find me on social media, Twitter and Instagram at Sabrina Maddeaux.
And then for me, people can go look up my YouTube show, The National Telegraph. Should be the first result if you go search that. And of course, then my the website I'm running everything off of right now is just wyattclaypool.com. And then again on social media, mostly just X. I'm just Wyatt, like Wyatt _ Claypool. I am 24 going on 85, and I still don't understand Instagram or TikTok or any of this stuff. I like Facebook. I don't know. I like Facebook.
You've updated to saying X at least. I still say Twitter. So
I know. I still feel like I'm saying a grammar error, though.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, again, thank you guys, and we'll keep in touch, and we'll keep following what you guys are doing. And thanks again for coming on.
Thank you.
Well, what did you think of that conversation, Scott? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Do you want to just delete it and never air it?
Well, if I were in the OLO, I think I'd probably do the latter there. Definitely want to delete it and never see it again. I really hope that what it does is it encourage, kind of like what both Wyatt and Sabrina said, encourages other candidates to come out and speak about this who have been through something similar, not just within the Conservative Party of Canada and not just at the federal level, but at all different levels. Just so everyone knows out there, we reached out to a number of other candidates who have been disqualified within the Conservative Party of Canada in this specific round. They're starting to pile up. And so many of them, I would say wanted to, but didn't because they're scared. Now, the nice thing about Wyatt and Sabrina is that they're both young. They both have and pardon my French, I don't give a shit type of attitude, which is great to see. And, but that they both have their own thing going on, right? They both have their own media stuff going on. So they can kind of do it. And I think media people, especially maverick media people like both of them, want to speak out on stuff like this. So I think it was a fantastic conversation. I didn't want it to end. I wanted to keep going. I wanted to ask Sabrina specifically because she had talked about it. I feel like I'm like Trent Horn doing like one of his debate reviews, where is longer than the actual debate. I wanted to ask Sabrina more about what she is thinking and envisioning what a Pierre Poilievre government looks like, because I get the feeling from her, and I don't want to put words in her mouth, but I get the feeling from her that she shares some of my concerns, that the expectations are being risen pretty high, and I don't know if that government that's potentially going to get elected is going to meet those expectations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, what do you think?
Yeah, I loved it. I thought it was really good. I think it's important. Obviously, we are hardcore pro-life or social conservative, but that doesn't mean a lot of pro-life podcasts just have other pro-lifers on all the time, and they just talk about how bad this is and how bad that is. And when we started,
we talk about how bad things are too, but
but when we started this podcast, we really wanted to try and bring on new people and have these conversations. So we had Julia Malott on, and we had Sabrina on, and people that you probably wouldn't see on a social conservative podcast. And that's what I think the beauty of our podcast is, and that we want to continue to do, is have these conversations, because they are really important. And, even as peripherally, as someone who had only read Sabrina's articles and how, we talked about this on the podcast before about, that she was, pro-abortion and whatever, hearing how she talked about open and fair nominations, that was extremely effective. She's really well spoken, and it benefits everybody, including social conservatives, that she's doing this. So it's just good to develop relationships, and that's how you get things done, and that's how you move forward. And we're in this really odd boat, because on one hand, we don't want to ostracize MPs, especially current sitting MPs, especially pro-life MPs and people we've worked to get elected in the last 6 years or 7 years. But on the other hand, we don't want to be silent about these things either. And they can, Sabrina and Wyatt can go on to other things, but this is our job. We have to continue to work within the confines of the party and that kind of thing, but we also can't just ignore what's going on. And so it is this delicate balance, but I think at the end of the day, we're always going to do what's right, and we're always going to speak about things that are wrong in the party, even if it might cost, even if, some people might be angry at this temporarily. It's the risk we're willing to take in order to have, beneficial change, not only for our cause, but also just the conservatives in general.
Yeah, and I think that like it's really interesting because we received an email earlier today from a dear friend of ours, a longtime supporter of ours, and rocked, ribbed, social conservative, up and down, all the way through. And she voted for Pierre in the leadership race, and until she was reading our emails, she had no idea of his extreme pro-abortion stance, the things that he was doing to MPs like Arnold Viersen, and the things that are happening to people like Wyatt and Sabrina, even though Sabrina doesn't share our views and values in that regard, and other people across the party. So it's important that we talk about it, even though some people might perceive as like, oh, you're always just attacking the Conservatives. Why are you never attacking the Liberals? Well, currently within the Liberal Party of Canada, we don't have an opportunity to get people pro-lifers elected. People who are not pro-life are also people too, but we don't have an opportunity to get pro-lifers elected. The one pro-lifer that remains within the Liberal Party of Canada, within the caucus, John McKay, announced this past Wednesday to caucus that he is not seeking re-election after 9 straight elections, which is completely understandable. So, within the Conservative Party of Canada, for the time being, with Justin Trudeau as the leader of the Liberals, this is kind of the one realistic political vehicle that we have if we want to actually get pro-lifers in the House of Commons. So it matters. It matters big time. And I think sunlight is the best disinfectant. The more that people talk about it, the more that people push back. And I think in a reasonable way, like, neither Sabrina or Wyatt came onto our podcast and they were lighting their hair on fire and saying crazy things. Like, they were calm, cool, collected. I mean, they're media people too. So I think it was great. And I think it's important that we do this and not to try and sound super whiny all the time. I mean, I don't want people to not get involved in nominations for good, solid candidates who are running for the Conservative Party of Canada that are in our database. I do want them to get involved because not all of them are being disqualified. I mean, look in Sabrina's case, right? The candidate that we supported was the one who benefited from unfortunate things that I don't think he or his campaign were doing, but that the party was doing. And I've heard that from different candidates too for the Conservative Party of Canada since Pierre has become leader, is that there's been certain interventions for these candidates that they do not want because it doesn't benefit them and it pisses people off. And yet it happens to them.
Arpan, David McKenzie, and Rick Roth all came out saying Garrett should have been disqualified, like the other candidates. Yeah. So, like, it doesn't help. Like, I'm sure Arpan doesn't enjoy this being thrown in his face all the time. I'm sure he would have wanted to win that without the chaos around him ensuing when it comes to Garrett. So you're right, it does do a huge disservice to these candidates as well. And one thing that, again, it's just like so reminiscent of the Ontario PC party under Patrick Brown. And one thing to mention is that, Sam Osterhoff got elected during that time. So it is possible to continue to nominate and elect good, solid people, maybe because they're underestimated by the party or whatever, but it doesn't help. Like Sabrina said, if you don't get involved, you're leaving all the decisions up to those who are. And that's what we just can't do right now, especially if there's going to be a majority government. And I think that a lot of even currently sitting MPs won't appreciate after time being told in caucus, you must say this, you must say that, repeat the lines, don't speak on issues you care about. If you do this, you will be kicked out, whatever is going on. They won't appreciate that. And maybe they'll...
It's easier that's an easier pill for them to swallow right now when it's less than 18 months until election day and you're 20 points ahead in the polls. When, it's 3 years to election day and you are tied to the polls or maybe behind, I think it's going to be a different story. And the other thing too is that a lot of these people in caucus that are currently sitting in caucus were not elected under Stephen Harper. They were elected predominantly under Andrew Scheer. So, they're not quite used to those Harper days, which I think a lot of people around Pierre Poilievre, like the Jenny Byrne types that were there previously in the Harper government were toward the end. They definitely had this. I don't know how appreciative, like you were saying, that these MPs are going to be of that type of attitude, especially after the election.
Yeah,
I hope at
100%.
least.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see you again next time in a couple weeks. Be sure to subscribe to us at thestinkingalbatross.ca, anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Rumble, YouTube, you name it, we're there. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for joining us.
Go Bombers.